Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our symposium for the fourth conference on the psychology of language learning. And this symposium is called Strategizing, Investigating the Dynamic Use of Strategies. My name is Isobel Wang from Murray House School of Education, University of Edinburgh. And this is my colleague, Andrew Cohen, and Professor Emeritus from the University of Minnesota. This is the first part of our hybrid symposium and includes a pre-recorded presentation provided by us and then followed by another pre-recorded presentation provided by Peter McIntyre and his colleagues. We will also provide a live discussion during the conference. Okay, so the focus of our presentation is to provide a very brief overview of prior language learner strategy studies and their limitations. And we will also report on 3 of our studies which offer a micro-analysis of strategies in use. In the last part of our presentation, we will also provide some suggestions for future research and pedagogical implications.
Okay, so again, very brief overview of our prior LLS studies. There are actually countless questionnaire-based studies that provide big picture results regarding the quantity of strategy use, lots on the quantity, the frequency of strategy use, learners' perceptions regarding the usefulness of strategy studies. And you know, there's a very robust literature on all of this. Okay. But there are limitations of strategy-based, questionnaire-based strategy studies. The data may be sparse with regard to description of actual strategizing shared by numerous learners, and with regard to individual learner differences. Learners may generalize based on self-report, a weak form of verbal report, because it doesn't tend to be based on actual task performance. It's where learners say, I believe that, or my general approach is to. Learners may be unaware of or ill-equipped to describe the actual complexity of their strategy use. Report on the use of individual strategies rather than strategy combinations. This is a glaring omission in the literature. Strategies are not being used isolatedly in many instances, but rather in clusters, in pairs or in clusters. The relationship between the variety in strategy use and the frequency with which any given strategy is used is often not linked to successful learning in the real world. This is a problem. We're not going to cite individual literature, but we do provide the references at the end of our PowerPoint.
Okay, so in response to these limitations of questionnaire-based studies, a narrative approach could potentially document strategies in detail. So narrative methods such as interviews, diaries, journals, blogs, and the photo voice. So photo voice is a kind of research technique that invites participants to record and reflect on their strategy use by means of photographic technique. So, so scholars in this field suggest a narrative approach could have the potential to give some insights into the dynamic, contextually situated characteristics of strategy use. Especially could help researchers to really gather some data on learner strategy use on an ongoing basis, and also help researchers to explore learners' changes in strategy use across time and context. But the questions to what extent do narrative methods capture the actual use of strategies in language tasks still remains.
So moving, therefore, toward more dynamic conceptualizations is what Isobel and I have been working on now for some years. Classification of language learner strategies have traditionally been based on the assumption that a given strategy has, as I pointed out before, just one single function. And even despite efforts to popularize the view that these strategies are actually multifunctional in nature, and Rebecca Oxford has frequently pointed out to me that she also has been calling attention to this, both in her 2017 book and even in her 1990 book. The perception of unifunctionality prevails worldwide. This is fascinating to me, but there's even a holy grail around it, that strategies have just one function. Part of the problem is that despite the rhetoric to the contrary, there has been little or no research to validate empirically that strategies are more than monolithic in nature. So let's look at this question of fluctuation in the function of any given strategy in the performance of a given task. So we'll take a strategy here, listening or reading strategy, could be either, determining the meaning of a word in a given context. So we have our configuration, and there's been a lot of more fine-tuned terminological splits, but basically metacognitive, cognitive, social, and affective are four functions that have gotten a lot of traction in the literature. So metacognitively here, we're orchestrating the search for word meaning. Cognitively, it's efforts at decoding oral or written content. Socially, you may be asking others for assistance in, hey, what do you think that word, I just saw a word in the context, what does it mean? Dealing with anxiety or frustration. The darn moments, and these are, well, now we're seeing more studies on emotions, but the research literature on affect tended to come up pretty dry. It was argued that, well, students didn't flag so much affective strategies. But we would contend that there are going to be numerous darn moments where students are frustrated in their learning, and it becomes a strategy at the point where it triggers some action to be taken to rectify the situation. So the description of strategies. One reason for inconclusive research findings is strategies included in the literature are sometimes, they're more skill-like than strategy-like. Like looking up a word in a dictionary is really a skill involving numerous strategies. Or guessing a word from context. There are a lot of ways to guess, a lot of strategies for guessing. Strategy descriptions tend to be at a level of generality that makes them a bit fuzzy and therefore not readily operationalizable. I'm concerned about what learners are going to be able to garner from feedback in the classroom tomorrow, and use metacognitive strategies more is not going to be very helpful. So what's the takeaway from this brief review of the literature? We need to shift the focus from what often amounts to strategy descriptions at a more macro level to strategy descriptions at the micro level, with the potential of generating outcomes that can be translated into guidelines for strategy use in handling language tasks.
Okay, so from this slide, we're going to talk about 3 studies demonstrating how we use verbal report techniques to assist us in performing a micro-analysis of strategies in use. So in this slide, this is the first study on the functions of strategies. So the aim of this study was to examine the two-moment functions, that is metacognitive, cognitive, social, or affective, that are activated in strategy use. So in terms of our research design, we involved three ESL and three EFL Chinese-speaking university students, and they were asked to individually perform an English vocabulary task that is making fine-tuned semantic distinctions. And we first use a word test to provide estimate of those students the depths of their vocabulary knowledge. And then they provided both introspective and retrospective verbal report on the functions that the strategies take on and the moments of fluctuation from one function to another. Okay, so the results of our study, we found there was a fluctuation in strategy functions when strategies were used either alone, in sequence, in pairs, or in clusters. We also identified different patterns of fluctuation in strategy functions. So there was not only one way linear progression from one function to another, but also two-way macro fluctuation, both for the same strategy and cross strategies. Okay, our second study, it looks how language learner strategies are actually used. The research aim was to investigate a hyperpolyglot strategies for fine-tuning his comprehension of Chinese vocabulary through mobile apps, online programs, and interactions with a tutor. We conducted a case study with this hyperpolyglot who had studied more than 12 languages. By the time when we're doing this study, he was studying Chinese as the 13th language in the foreign language context. And the subject videotape all his verbal report sessions on the strategies that he used to arrive at his comprehension of word meanings in context. So the results. We found the subject used various strategies for managing vocabulary resources, including planning, organizing, and monitoring or evaluating their use, and strategies for processing the information in the resources, finding word equivalents in Chinese for English words, fine-tuning the meanings of words, and then verifying these fine-tunings. He predominantly used strategies either in sequence or in pairs, sometimes separately, and only occasionally in clusters. And the subject was successful at fine-tuning 57% of the vocabulary items through accessing selected resources. Although he was a highly skilled language learner and user, but it's still worth noting that nevertheless, his fine-tuning effort didn't work 43% of the time. Okay, let's move on to the third study. Our third study is about how learners actually process strategy instruction. And the aim of this study was to explore how learners actually interacted with strategy instruction materials, specially designed to enhance their efforts to fine-tune the comprehension of academic writing vocabulary. And we conducted a multiple case study with 4 advanced ESL learners. The subjects first completed a measure of their learning styles and then provided introspective and retrospective verbal report data and log entries during and after each interactive session with the strategy instruction materials over an 8-week period. So come to the results, and we found that engaging in these sections heightened their awareness of strategies for fine-tuning both their comprehension and the production of academic vocabulary, and also developed their ability to orchestrate their strategy use. But we also find, although they use the strategies suggested by the strategy instruction materials, but they still encounter some difficulties in determining whether their vocabulary fine-tuning were successful. And we also find their style preferences appear to play a significant role in their strategy choices for accessing the materials.
Great. Okay, so now we're going to wrap this brief presentation up with suggestions for future research and also pedagogical implications. With regard to the first study, we would recommend basing the strategy categorizations on rigorous piloting in order to avoid outcomes providing only limited support when needing to employ strategies associated with a given language skill. In other words, sometimes studies get top heavy. There's a lot of categorization, building of frameworks, but when you get to the actual questionnaires used in the data, they're not providing useful guidance in what to do with the data, and you're left with data that are not adequately analyzed. Further exploration of ways to raise learners' awareness as to how effective their strategy use is in arriving at the desired fine-tuning, that would be a suggestion for future research in study 2, exploring ways to raise learners' awareness as to how effective their strategy use is. Because what we found was the subject, in this case it was me, learning my 13th language, Chinese, I wasn't necessarily aware of whether I had arrived at a successful fine-tuning of comprehension or not. Study 3, further investigation of the long-term effects of self-access strategy instruction materials through video recorded report and other process-oriented methods like eye tracking would be useful in order to better understand the relationship among 1, strategies, 2, style preferences, and 3, the learning context. So finally, pedagogical implications. Study 1, if breakdowns occurring at the strategy functional level can be pinpointed through microanalysis, then learners, with the assistance of their instructors, could take remedial action accordingly. With regard to study 2, teachers could provide strategy instruction for learners, especially regarding how they, A, select strategies which are most appropriate for them, and B, sustain motivation over time in the face of frustration in dealing with language tasks. It's so much the case that learners select strategies which aren't necessarily the most appropriate for them, but they aren't really aware of it. And we know that learners stop learning languages because they're so frustrated by the outcomes. And the challenge is to keep the motivation going. Teachers could, study 3, teachers could identify how their students successfully combine strategies in the completion of language tasks and provide coaching for learners engaged in self-access strategy instruction as to how they might utilize different kinds of resources. For example, when in need of remedial action after the use of a given strategy, and when it does not produce the desired results, what should be done? Okay, this is what we prepared in our asynchronous portion. We're sad that we were not able to be at the meeting, which we would have been at physically a couple of years ago. I had my tickets, booked my hotel room and all sorts of good stuff, and that didn't happen. But now we're into this virtual world, and it's great that we can do that. We have the synchronous portion coming up when Sarah Mercer is our discussant. We're looking forward to her comments and to jumping in on the discussion. So thank you very much for following what we've presented here. We encourage you to take a look at our references. These are the studies. These are the published papers on the 3 studies. we provide them in our references. And then, as you see, we have all the other papers that we refer to in our studies, in our slideshow, and papers that are available. Any of them that are available, I've posted on my website, and you can also contact me about papers that I wasn't able to post, but that I can send to you individually through ResearchGate. So again, thank you very much for your attention to our presentation.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.